Book 7. 1. For Elasaris, king of Amathi, sent Gadalcaris, who praised him for his justice and wealth, and brought him many gifts, among which 3 were prominent Ethiopian slaves, whom he had bought from Babylonia. Experts in many arts. For they provoked the serpent to anger by presenting him with purple, but afterwards they approached him with an undaunted countenance, and kissed him when he was about to bite without any danger. Nor did they suffer anything, but thrust a sword sharp on both sides through his mouth to the very heart. Gadalcaris, while he was doing these and many other things, looked on with great pleasure, and adorned him with many honors, for first he gave a gift to the scribe. Secondly, he made him commander of the fleet, but thirdly he had nothing to give, since he neither knew the art of writing, nor was he expert in matters of war. And even if he had been expert in these matters, he could still have instituted nothing, since he did not even understand the dialect of the Sidonians. The king therefore created him chief judge, but in his place there were others at the gates, who were to perform the office of judge. Gadalcaris very liberally supplied these men with magnificent garments and many riches. They also lived in the same citadel with the king, so that the king, if he happened to be sleepless, could summon them, and spend his time watching him accomplish those rare and wonderful things. But the authors of unjust sentences, and extorting many coins, greatly troubled the Sidonians. They were also in hatred of kings, for they used the king of the Aradians more insolently, but they prevented the prince of the Berythians, who aspired to the supreme power in the war against the giants, from accepting it. In this way they made everyone angry. 2. But Gadalcaris, who had no children, was persuaded by the Ethiopians to adopt a son and to choose Bartiphus the Tyrian as his successor, because they had received many magnificent gifts from him. However, the kings of Berytus and Arad, from the tribe of the Ochritobomalli, by which name were those who descended from Bimelus called, who envied Bartiphus the supreme power, and yet were unable to wrest it from him, the Ethiopians, the authors of the king's decision, decided to overthrow him by force. They therefore accused him as having prepared a plot against the life of the great king, and by giving false testimonies, they persuaded Gadalcaris to remove them bound in chains to the island of Citium. 3. A little later Gadalcaris died in the 43rd year of his reign, after Balmaboro had held the power of the Biblians for 29 years. Then the Ochritobomalli, who held the government of Berytus and Arad and the islands, formed an army and armed a fleet, in order to fight for the supreme power with Bartiphus, to whom Bibli and Obdalius, the ruler of the island of Miletus, came to their aid. But the Sidonians, who followed neither side, were determined to obey whoever should gain the victory. But when Bartiphus had defeated them and had subdued all the towns to himself, the Ochritobomalli fled to the islands and founded many colonies. Bartiphus sent kings to the towns, whom he had chosen from among his companions, and he did not live with the Sidonians, because they had not helped him, but in the city of Tyre, which from that time on is the leader of all the cities both maritime and inland. 4. Having thus gained possession of all of Phoenicia, Bartiphus was unable to subdue the colonies, because the Ochritobomalli, adorning their large fleet, easily held the command of the sea. Several times they also attempted to overwhelm the town of Arbon, which was then fortified, by surprise, and were defeated by the Berytii. Bartiphus, however, decided to storm the colonies, but since the enemy presented a multitude of ships, he ordered all the princes to prepare as much naval material as they could and to bring it to Tyre for the arsenal, which he himself had enlarged. But when he once entered the harbor to inspect the construction of the ships and in this way to incite the industry of the men, his eye was wounded by a certain splinter, which they very quickly extracted, and the king carried to the citadel. But this wound in the eye, although treated with great care, became so serious that it proved fatal, and Bartiphus died the next day, after he had held the supreme power for 6 years. 5. When he died, they made Joram the son of Bartipha, whom the Tyrians call Heber, king. He reigned here 57 years. Here he equipped 79 long ships, and sent a large army to Citium, where the Ocritobermali had gathered a large force. But the Tyrians had been besieging the city for a long time and were already beginning to despair of taking it. But the Ethiopians, whom we have mentioned above, deserters, came from the city, where they had been most cruelly harassed by the Ocritobermali, and said that the townspeople were filled with great joy and full of wine, because they had observed that the Tyrians were despairing of taking the city. Therefore, the Tyrians, having stopped their tents, as if they were going to depart, affirmed that they would easily capture the city if they climbed the walls at night. Following this advice, the Tyrians weighed anchor and set sail, pretending that they were going to set out for Phoenicia as quickly as possible. But when the day drew to a close, they returned, having taken the city and massacred all the Ocritobermals, as well as some of the Cytians. When this victory was announced to the colonies, they all sent ambassadors to Tyre, to swear by the words of Joram. The king was also glad to hear that those Ethiopians were present, remembering how much they had already benefited his father, and how much benefit they had brought him. He heaped upon them with favors throughout his life. 6. At this time Obdalius Milites, king of the island, had sent all his forces to Citium to come to the aid of the Tyrians. When the barbarians who inhabited Tenga noticed this and saw the island stripped of ships and men, they arrived under the leadership of Plushico, who had married Obdalius's daughter, and having massacred Obdalius and many others, they plundered the region and set fire to the city. 7. Now Joramus ordered all the kings of the cities and islands to write accounts of the multitude of inhabitants, ships, arms, horses, chariots, reapers and wealth, and to send men to the neighboring regions to describe them, and he commanded them to write a book about these things. In this way he was the author of a description of all the regions situated towards the west and those which looked towards the east, and of the islands and the Mediterranean regions. The Ethiopians, however, informed the king that there were also large and bright regions to look towards the south, and that the multitude of inhabitants was immense, and that this tract produces many precious things: gold and silver and iron and gems and ebony and pepper and elephants and monkeys and parrots and peacocks and many other things. But that there is a certain peninsula that extends to the east, the furthest, whose inhabitants could see the sun rising from the sea. 8. Joramus therefore sent ambassadors to Netambalus, king of the Babylonians, who spoke in this way: I hear that the regions of the Ethiopians are great and most famous, certainly easy to reach from Babylon, but inaccessible from Tyre, which I would like to know. If therefore you will give my servants suitable ships, I will send you 100 purple robes, having reported to Netambalus. With these words, he wanted to give ships to the Tyrians. But the Ethiopians, who are accustomed to go to the Babylonians as merchants, all said that they would leave the city if Joramus would give him permission to sail to Ethiopia. 9. After this, Joramus promised Irenaeus the Jew, if he would give him a port situated on the Ethiopian sea, that he would help in the construction of the royal citadel and would bring cedar and fir wood and square stones. Moved by these things, Irenaeus gave the town and port of Elothum to Joramus. Since there was indeed a multitude of palm trees there, but not suitable for building ships, Joramus sent about 8,000 camels to Elothum, loaded with naval materials, and ordered the craftsmen to build 10 ships. He appointed Sadaris, Jaminus, and Cotylus as the chief captains of the fleet. 2 of the Ethiopians have already died. But Lancopatus, who was quite alive, when he first heard that the fleet was about to sail, went to his country. They sailed across the sea to Helotes, but terrible storms prevented them from crossing the strait. Meanwhile they lived on a certain island for 5 months, planting wheat in the lower land, and reaped a very rich harvest. Afterwards they sailed eastward through the strait, and leaving the Arabian region behind, and after many days had passed, they noticed the ships of the Babylonians returning from Ethiopia to their homeland. The next day they reached Ethiopia itself, whose coastal region is dry and sandy, while the inland region is mountainous. For 10 days they sailed eastward past the shores. There, however, a land of immense extent turns to the south, where the Ethiopians inhabit large and famous cities. They also sail the seas. However, their ships are not equipped for war and do not use sails. Therefore, sailing southward for 36 days, they reached the island of the Rhaetians. 10. They cast anchors in the vicinity of a low shore and planted with many tall trees. But at night, when storms arose, they were in great danger until sunrise. Having set out from there, they saw a safe harbor at noon and villages in the inland region, many and well populated, where, when they set out, they were surrounded by the multitude of people who inhabited those villages. But the prefect of that region received them hospitably and prepared for them most splendid banquets for 7 days. For in the meantime he had sent a messenger to the great king, to consult him about the Tyrians, who, when he returned after 7 days had passed, the prefect summoned the Tyrians and set out with them on a journey to the king, who lived at Rochapata, which is the name of the largest and most famous city in the middle of the island. Many spearmen went ahead, sent by the king, to drive away the elephants with the clang of their spears, of whom they feared both because of their multitude and their audacity, since it was the time when they seek copulation. The Tyrians followed, of whom Sidaris, Cotylus, and Jaminus were carried in litters. Some country men carried gifts. The train was closed by the prefect with his attendants, borne on an elephant. On this journey, when on the 3rd day they were crossing a river, one of the crossing men was devoured by crocodiles, of which rivers abound. But after 3 days' journey, they saw the city of Rochapata, surrounded by very high mountains. When they heard that they were coming, for this news had gone out throughout the whole country, all the inhabitants of the city came with great speed, carried either on elephants or asses or litters, to see the Tyrian men. There was also a great multitude of foot soldiers. But the centurion escorted them into the royal citadel, which was the largest and most splendid, and closed the gates so that the multitude might not enter, and then he introduced them to King Rhaetius, who was sitting on very splendid couches. They presented him with horses, purple garments, and cedar saddles. The king gave them gifts of gold, 2,000 prominent elephant tusks, and an abundance of fine cinnamon. He entertained them as guests for 30 days. 11. Some of the Tyrians also died on the island, one consumed by disease, the other killed by the gods. For a man found goat dung, and signs drawn in the sand, and invited a certain prelate to a game. For him, therefore, it was goat dung. But when another could not find camel dung, for they are not found on the island, he used cow dung, with which that region abounded. And he put the cut-up signs on it. But the priest, who happened to be present, dissuaded them from the game, because cow dung is held sacred by them, and while they were laughing, he went away. The men continued to play, but soon collapsed, and died on the last day, and all those present feared the gods. One of the dead was a Jerusalemite by birth. 12. This most famous island of Rhaetium is surrounded on all sides by the sea, except that on the opposite side, which is under the moor. It is possible to go across the isthmus to those tracts which are on the opposite side. This land was made by heaping up mud by Bao, whose traces are also found in the mountains, and from which the great king traces his origin. The island is 6 days' journey wide, 12 days' journey long, and is very fertile and endowed with many inhabitants. The produce of the island is excellent, for the sea offers to its inhabitants an abundance of fish of the most delicious taste, but the mountains nourish many wild animals, and the largest among them elephants, and produce very aromatic cassia. They find gold and gems in the rivers, and on the shores are unions. 4 governors reign in the island, who are subject to the great king, and pay tribute in cassia and elephants and unions and gems. For gold is abundant to the king himself. The first, therefore, reigns in that part which looks towards the south, where there are herds of elephants, which are caught there in great numbers and of exceptional size. The shores of this tract are inhospitable and deserted to men. The city where the governor lives is said to be the largest and most famous, and is situated in the Mediterranean region. The second king rules over the region towards the west, which produces cinnamon. The Tyrians sailed there. The third king has the dominion over the region which looks towards the north, abounding in alliances. He also built a very high wall in the gorges, lest the barbarians, who inhabited the region which is seen from the opposite side, should pass through. For in the past, rushing in, they devastated the dwellings, the sanctuaries and the groves which they found, and massacred the inhabitants who had not fled to the mountains. The fourth possesses the part which looks towards the east, and which produces gems, lychnight, sapphire and diamond. All these, brothers of the great king Rochapater, rule over these regions. But the highest power belongs to each of the eldest, and he is called the great and most powerful king. But he possesses 1,000 black elephants, and 5 white ones. For the forests nourish the abundance of blacks, but the half-white ones are very rare, and are not found anywhere except on this island, and are said to be worshipped by the blacks. But when they have caught such an animal, they take it to the king of Rochapater, to whom alone the laws permit a white elephant to be carried. This is forbidden to subjects. There are also very many crocodiles in the rivers, and with wonderful ferocity, but they are killed by a multitude of men, who throw themselves into the river, and use sharp poles. After they had been at Rochapater for 10 days, many Tyrians also set out with Ratius to hunt crocodiles. 13. When the ships had returned, he ordered a column to be erected before the temple of Melechethus and all that had been done to be inscribed. That column had indeed been shattered by an earthquake the previous year, but it is intact, so that the inscription can still be read. 14. At the same time the temple of the Cassiopei Cabiri was defiled by the destruction. For a man lived near Gabula, which he had received from Abibah, the son of Topha. He was passionately in love with a virgin, but, without his father's knowledge, there could be no custom among them in the temples. Therefore they held nocturnal assemblies in the vestibule of the temple by the lake of Pontus, and they joked while drinking wine. But the virgin, being oppressed by the 2 aediculums, escaped, but Gabulius, who attempted to seize her, threw the other one down, so that the man, deprived of his mitre, might cease to pursue her in the darkness. And he gouged out the eye of the other with a vessel, which he happened to be holding in his hands full of wine.